Welcome to our deep dive. This time, it's the Book of Numbers. Yeah, numbers. Now, you might be thinking, numbers? Just a bunch of, numbers. But stick with us. We're going to use this narration we found. It's from this YouTube channel called God's Able to uncover some really interesting stuff about the ancient Israelites. Like their lives, beliefs, even their laws.
It really is like stepping back in time. You get this glimpse into a society that's like so different from ours.
Right. And there's a lot we can learn from their stories about their relationship with God, their challenges, what happened when they made certain choices. Okay, so picture this. The Israelites, they've just escaped Egypt, right? They're wandering in the wilderness, free, but kind of facing a ton of uncertainty. So what's the first thing God tells them? Take a head count. Seriously. Numbers 1 and 2 lay out this super detailed census. But it's not just like how many people there are.
Exactly. It's like this massive organizational project.
Yeah.
They're about to go on this journey, this whole new land, and they needed to be organized for travel, defense, like for everything. The census, it included all the men, 20 and older, who could serve in the army. It's like they were creating a blueprint for their whole new society.
It's like a giant spreadsheet.
Right.
But for a nomadic nation.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And it gets even more interesting when you look at the numbers for each tribe. Like Judah, for example, was way bigger than the others.
It's true. That's a detail that always stood out to me. It makes you think, about their influence, there's strength maybe, like foreshadowing their future role. They did become the tribe of King David and ultimately Jesus.
It's like those early numbers, they hinted at their destiny. And it makes you realize these weren't just names on a list. These were real families, individuals, all with their own stories. But speaking of groups, there's one tribe that's like totally different.
The Levites.
The Levites, yeah. They had a completely different role. They weren't even included in the main census.
Yeah. The Levites, they were set apart for religious service. They were descended from Levi, one of Jacob's 12 sons. And their big job, was to take care of the tabernacle.
The tabernacle, that was like their portable sanctuary, right?
Yeah.
Where they kept the Ark of the Covenant.
Exactly. And the rules around that tabernacle, those were serious. Anyone who went near those sacred objects without being authorized.
Big trouble.
Big trouble.
It's put to death kind of trouble. Why so severe? It seems pretty extreme to us today.
Well, remember, this idea of ritual purity, it was everything to them, central to their whole belief system. They believed that God's presence was holy and anything that, threatened that had to be dealt with seriously. The Levites, as caretakers of the tabernacle, they were like the guardians, protecting the community from God's wrath.
It's like they were walking a tightrope, wasn't it? Between the sacred and the profane, with very little room for error. Our source even describes this whole elaborate process for covering and transporting the Ark of the Covenant. They couldn't even look at it directly. Speaking of rules, though, the Book of Numbers has a lot of them, right?
Oh, yeah.
Particularly those dealing with ritual purity and, uncleanliness.
Right. These laws governed almost everything in their lives. What they ate, how they handled childbirth, even death. Like if someone touched a dead body, they had to go through this whole purification process. It even involved the ashes of a sacrificed red heifer.
A red heifer. That's pretty specific. What was the significance of that?
It's a ritual that really highlights how important both the physical and spiritual realms were to them. You see, purity wasn't just about being physically clean. It was about their relationship with God and keeping the whole community sacred.
So different from our modern ideas about hygiene, isn't it?
It is, but it gives us this amazing window into their worldview, how they understood the sacred. They were constantly aware of the need to be ritually pure, to stay in good standing with God. It really makes you think, how do different cultures approach these concepts? What comes to mind for you when you think of purity? Is it more physical? Or is there more to it?
It makes you think about how our ideas about purity, how they've evolved, right?
Yeah.
But even with all these laws, the Israelites, they weren't exactly perfect. They had their doubts. They rebelled against Moses' leadership.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, despite all the miracles, God's guidance, they often struggled. Fear, disobedience, you name it. Their journey through the wilderness. Full of complaints, questioning, and sometimes outright rebellion.
Like that time they started complaining about the food, right?
Yeah.
God was providing manna from heaven, but they were tired of it.
It's true.
They're craving meat.
And missing the fish they ate back in Egypt.
I know. It's almost comical, right? Here they are, free from slavery, being led to this land of promise. They're grumbling about the menu. Shows how quickly we can forget the good things,
It does. It's focusing on what we lack.
And their complaining didn't go over well, did it? God sent quail, tons of it, but then he punished them.
A plague.
A plague for their ingratitude. It's a powerful reminder, even when things are tough, focusing on the negative can blind us to the blessings we already have. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that, where you were so focused on what you didn't have that you missed the good things?
Oh, I think that's a human experience we can all relate to. We all fall into that trap sometimes. But sometimes the rebellion in Numbers, it went beyond just grumbling about food. There were these direct challenges to Moses' authority, and none more dramatic than the story of Korah.
Korah's story is wild. He was a Levite, right? And he challenged Moses' leadership, gathered a bunch of followers to, support him. He questioned the whole structure of their society, God's chosen leadership, everything.
And the consequences were severe. Like, the earth literally opened up and swallowed Korah and all his followers. Wow.
It's pretty dramatic. Shows how God felt about challenges to his chosen leadership.
It's a powerful story.
Yeah.
But it raises some questions, like what do you think it teaches us about leadership? Power, dissent within a community. Is it ever right to challenge authority? And if so, how do we do it constructively instead of, destructively?
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
It is a reminder that every society needs structure, order. But leadership isn't about absolute power. It's about serving the community, upholding what's right. And sometimes that means listening to those dissenting voices,
Yeah.
being open to change.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It is.
Knowing when to stand firm, when to adapt. But let's move on to another fascinating character. Balaam, the pagan prophet. His story it's just wild.
Balaam, yeah, his story is one of my favorites. Full of twists and turns. It really shows God's power and sovereignty.
So Balak, the king of Moab, is terrified of the Israelites. So he sends for Balaam, hoping to use his prophetic powers to curse them. But get this, Balaam is repeatedly prevented from doing it, first by his own talking donkey. Can you imagine? You're just riding along and suddenly your donkey starts talking.
Right.
And warning you of danger. It's hilarious, but also, profound. The donkey, it could see an angel blocking the path, an angel that Balaam couldn't see. So it refused to move, and it saved Balaam from harm. It's a reminder that God often works in ways we just don't expect,
Yeah.
And that even animals can be instruments of his will.
It wasn't just the donkey, though. God himself intervenes. He puts words in Balaam's mouth, forcing him to bless the very people he was hired to curse. It's like God saying, nope, not going to happen. My plan's bigger than that.
Exactly. Balaam, despite being willing to go along with it at first, he ends up having to speak God's truth. Instead of curses, you get these beautiful blessings on Israel. Their strength, their favor in God's eyes, their future triumphs. God's plan is bigger than any human scheme, any manipulation.
Powerful reminder that we can't thwart God's will no matter how hard we try. Right. But it also shows that sometimes our greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places. But let's shift gears a bit to a more somber note. Numbers also tells the story of the death of Aaron, Moses' brother.
Right.
And the appointment of Joshua as his successor.
That's a significant moment, the end of an era. Aaron and Moses, they led the Israelites through so much. And his passing, just as they're about to enter the promised land, it really signifies this transition to a new generation of leadership.
And makes you think about their different leadership styles, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet who spoke to God directly, and Joshua, the military leader tasked with conquering this land. What do their contrasting styles tell us?
It says a lot about the nature of leadership. Different situations, they call for different skills, approaches. Moses, with his deep spiritual connection, he provided guidance. He established that legal foundation. But Joshua, with his strength, his strategic thinking, he was ready to lead them in battle, to secure their place in the promised land. Like passing baton, right?
Yeah.
Each runner has their own strengths, but they're all working towards the same goal.
And speaking of the relay race, the Israelites' journey was far from over. Even with Joshua in charge, they still faced a ton of obstacles, tons of challenges.
Oh, absolutely. The book of Numbers, it goes on to tell of their battles, their interactions with other nations, and even their own internal struggles. Their journey was this constant test of faith and patience, and there's so much more to explore.
There is. Maybe we should pause here.
Yeah.
Catch our breath and come back to it after a short break.
That's good.
We'll be right back. So we were talking about how the Israelites, even with Joshua leading, still faced a ton of challenges.
Oh, yeah?
Your journey wasn't a walk in the park.
Not at all. It tested them, that's for sure. Their resilience, their faith, how much they could trust God, even when things were rough.
Right.
And remember, they were going from, a nomadic life to becoming a settled nation. That comes with a whole new set of challenges.
It's like moving from a tent to a house. You get more stability, but then you've got more responsibility too.
Mm-hmm.
And potential conflicts with the neighbors, right?
Yeah.
And the Israelites, they had their share of conflicts, both, outside and within their own community.
Definitely. They had enemies, natural disasters, and even their own doubts to deal with.
Yeah.
Like, remember the story about the king of Arad, a Canaanite ruler who attacked the Israelites? It was a real threat, and they needed God's help badly.
They even made a vow to God. They said, if you deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities. That's pretty intense. It shows how much they depended on God.
Right. It does. For protection. For victory. Their vow, it shows how serious this conflict was. And how strongly they believed God would step in. It's interesting, isn't it, how far people will go when they believe they're fighting for, a divine cause. What do you think about that kind of commitment? Even when facing danger?
It makes you think about the power of belief, right? And what people will do when they feel like they're fighting for survival. The Israelites, they were convinced this was about their future, the land God promised them. But it wasn't just battles with enemies, right? There were those internal struggles too, like that incident with the venomous snakes.
Oh, the snakes. That story always gets me. It's how quickly we turn on each other, And on God, when things go wrong, they were tired of wandering. They were thirsty. They missed, the easy life back in Egypt. And they started complaining. Again. They said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? They even said, there's no bread, no water, and this food is terrible. We hate it. Like, they totally forgot about all the miracles.
Parting the Red Sea, the manna from heaven, all of it.
We can be so quick to lose sight of the big picture, can't we?
Yeah.
When we're focused on, just how uncomfortable we are. They were so focused on what they didn't have that they forgot to be grateful for what they did. And that negativity, it had consequences.
God sent venomous snakes. A lot of people died.
It's harsh, but it's a reminder. Our words, our attitude, they have power.
Yeah.
Negativity, it's toxic. For ourselves and for everyone around us. But God, even in their suffering, He gave them a way out.
He told Moses to make a bronze snake. Put it on a pole.
Anyone who was bitten, they could look at it and live.
Such a powerful symbol. The bronze snake, it's the thing that caused their suffering. But God uses it to heal them, to save them. It's a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
God can work through the most unexpected things. What do you think about the symbolism there? It shows the power of faith.
Right.
It didn't make sense to look at a snake for healing, but those who trusted God's instructions, they were saved. It also makes me think about Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
Lifted up to offer salvation to everyone who believes.
That's a great connection. God can use even our mistakes, our failures, to bring about good. And there's always hope, even when we're suffering. But the Israelites, they eventually reached Moab. It was east of the Jordan River.
Right.
And that's where we run into Balak and Balaam again.
Balak, the king of Moab, the one who tried to hire Balaam to curse the Israelites.
Right.
That story really makes you think about the limits of human power and how God is ultimately in control.
He is. Despite Balak's efforts, Balaam ends up blessing the Israelites instead of cursing them. And what he says, it's full of these incredible images, profound insights into Israel's destiny.
Like one of the things he says, it's about a future king.
Yeah.
A ruler who will come from Jacob's line. It's obviously pointing to the coming of a Messiah.
It is. It's like a glimpse into God's long-term plan for Israel and for the world. Their role as His chosen people, destined for greatness, and eventually the source of a savior.
It's amazing how these stories still speak to us today, isn't it?
It is.
They give us insights into faith, leadership, the human condition, all of it. But as we know, even people who experience God's favor, His guidance, they can still stumble.
Oh, yeah.
And the Israelites, they were no exception.
They had their weak moments, that's for sure. Like that whole thing with the Moabite women. They got caught up in idolatry, sexual immorality, and it brought God's anger down on them. A devastating plague.
It's a classic story, isn't it?
It is.
Temptation and what happens when you stray from God's path. We all face temptations. Even those closest to God can mess up. but it's also about how individual actions can affect the whole community, right?
Absolutely. Like Zimri, remember him, that Israelite who brought a Midianite woman into the camp right out in the open. It was blatant defiance, he disregarded God's law, and it just fueled the plague.
Our choices, especially when they go against God's will, they can have consequences, far-reaching consequences. But even in all that chaos, that judgment, there's also an example of an individual taking action that had a good impact. Phinehas. He was a priest and he stepped up.
Phinehas.
Driven by his zeal for God, he took matters into his own hands.
His actions were quick, decisive. He confronted Zimri and the woman, stopped them, and the plague stopped too. Some might question his methods, but it was seen as an act of righteousness, appeased God's anger. It really makes you think how different cultures, different times, how they view justice and mercy. What's the balance? It's not easy.
It really makes you think, yeah, about taking action to uphold what's right, even when it means going against what everyone else is doing. But after all that, God told Moses to do another census. This time, it was to prepare for dividing up the promised land.
It was. That second census, in Numbers 26, it's more than just counting people. It's about fulfilling God's promise to Abraham. The Israelites, they were finally on the verge of entering Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey.
It's exciting to see how their story goes from slavery to freedom to wandering to finally settling in that land.
Yeah.
But dividing the land, it raises some questions too, doesn't it?
It does.
Of fairness, inheritance, even the rights of women, like the story of Zelophehad's daughters.
That's a fascinating one. They were advocating for their rights in a society that was very patriarchal. Their father had died, and he didn't have any sons, so they were worried about what would happen to their inheritance.
Because, according to their laws, they wouldn't have been entitled to anything.
Right.
But they were brave. They went to Moses, argued their case, said their father's name, his lineage. It shouldn't be erased just because he didn't have sons.
And their argument, it was very convincing. They pointed out that their father, he was a good man. He died because of his own sin, not because he rebelled against God. And Moses, he listened. He went to God for guidance.
What did God say?
He agreed with the daughters, said they should get their father's inheritance. And that set a precedent. For women inheriting property when there were no male heirs, justice, fairness, they should prevail, even when it means challenging those old norms.
Their story reminds us that sometimes we have to speak up for what's right, even when it's tough. But it didn't end there, right? The tribal leaders, they were worried. What if the daughters married men from other tribes?
Yeah, it was a valid concern. The land was being divided so carefully, they didn't want to see it get all messed up, so they went back to Moses, looking for answers.
And God, he provided a solution, didn't he?
He did. He said that Zelophehad's daughters, they could marry whoever they wanted, but they had to marry within their own tribe. That way, their inheritance would stay in the tribe of Manasseh. No land lost, no tribal boundaries messed up.
God finding a solution that honored both, individual rights and the needs of the whole community.
Exactly.
These stories, the inheritance, the dividing of the land, it shows how important order and structure was as they were getting ready to enter the promised land.
They were going from being nomads to being settled. And these laws, they were a framework for that new life.
Right. And as we keep exploring Numbers, we'll see how those themes, law, order, divine guidance, they keep shaping their journey.
They do.
As they face new challenges, new triumphs in Canaan, we've come a long way with them, from slavery to the very edge of the promised land. And their story, well, it's not over yet. There's a lot left to unpack in the final chapters. We'll see how they navigate this new land,
right?
How they establish their society, how they live out their covenant with God. But for now, maybe we can just take a minute, reflect on what we've learned.
Yeah.
What sticks out to you? What resonates with your own experiences, your own challenges?
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'm struck by how resilient they were and how adaptable. They faced so many obstacles, but they kept going.
They did.
They learned to adjust to new situations, to lean on God for guidance, to solve problems. Even when things seemed impossible, there was always hope. There was always a way forward.
It's true. Their story shows how strong the human spirit can be, how we can overcome, how we can find strength in faith, in community. Their journey continues, full of ups and downs. But through it all, we see God's faithfulness, His guidance, His love for His people. And now it's time to delve into those final chapters. We'll see the end of their journey and the beginning of something new.
All right, so we're back, ready for the final chapters of Numbers. We've been with the Israelites through so much.
We have, and now they're finally about to cross the Jordan River. They're going to step foot into the promised land. It's got to feel like reaching the finish line after a marathon.
Right.
Right.
But then there's all that work of settling in, making it home.
Exactly. It wasn't just about arriving. It was about starting this whole new society, a new way of life based on their covenant with God.
Exactly. And that meant following God's instructions, even when those instructions were, well, tough.
And some of them were intense. In Numbers 33 and 34, God gives them this very specific plan for conquering and dividing the land. He tells them to drive out the people who are already living there, destroy their idols, and demolish their high places.
Yeah, it sounds pretty harsh to us today. But remember, the Israelites believed they were fighting for like a divinely ordained purpose, you know. They saw the Canaanites as idolaters who were defiling the land. They thought it was their duty to purify it, to make it a place where God could be present.
Makes you think about the relationship between religion and violence, doesn't it?
It does. How do we reconcile the idea of a loving God with these commands to conquer and destroy? It's complicated. People have been debating it for a long time.
It does make you think about faith and how people interpret their beliefs, how they act on them. But it wasn't just about conquering, right? God also gave them specific instructions for dividing the land between the tribes. It's like this, divine real estate plan.
It was. Each tribe got a portion based on their size, their needs. The whole point was to be fair, to prevent arguments.
Yeah, because they were going from being nomads, where owning land wasn't that important, to being settled farmers.
Right.
And now, suddenly, land was everything. It meant security, prosperity, their future. So, yeah, it makes sense to have a clear system in place.
Yeah, imagine the chaos without a plan.
Right. But what about the Levites?
Mm.
They weren't part of the land division, right? Because their whole job was religious service. So how were they taken care of?
Well, God told the other tribes to give the Levites towns to live in, all throughout the land, and pasture land for their animals.
So they were part of the community but had this separate role.
Exactly. Spiritual leaders, teachers, like a network of religious centers, so everyone had access to that guidance and support.
I like that. And within these Levitical towns, 6 were chosen as cities of refuge.
Oh, yes. The cities of refuge.
What were those for?
Okay, so imagine you're living back then and you accidentally kill someone.
Okay.
Maybe a tool slips, a rock falls, whatever. You're not a murderer. It was an accident. But back then, the family of the person who died, they had the right to revenge. They could be the avenger of blood.
Oh, wow. That's intense. So what did people do to protect themselves?
The cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed someone, you could go to one of these cities and be safe. There'd be a trial. And if they decided it really was an accident, you'd be protected from the avenger until things calmed down.
It's like a system of checks and balances.
Yeah.
To make sure there was justice, but also prevent these cycles of revenge.
Exactly. They understood that people make mistakes and that there needed to be both accountability and compassion.
But even with all these laws, all these instructions, God knew humans weren't perfect. We mess up, we sin, intentionally or not.
It's true.
So was there a way to deal with those mistakes, a way to make things right with God?
Yes. Numbers lays out a whole system of atonement specifically for unintentional sins, a way to ask for forgiveness, to restore that relationship with God. And it involved offerings, sacrifices, specific actions to cleanse themselves from what they'd done wrong.
It's serious business. Their covenant with God. It wasn't just rules, it was a relationship, one that needed to be taken care of and fixed when it was broken.
Right. And it wasn't just big public displays. It was the little things, too. Like, remember the tassels they wore on their clothes? That was about remembering God's commands.
Oh yeah, the tassels. It's easy to miss that detail, but it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it was like a visual reminder. Those tassels, they had a blue cord on them, and it was a way to keep God's laws, their commitment to Him, front and center all the time.
Yeah, a constant reminder.
Kind of like how people today might wear a religious symbol or keep a special quote on their desk. It's that same idea, you know, staying connected.
Makes sense. We all want to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, right? That gives us meaning, purpose. And for them, that connection was through their covenant with God, through trying to live by His laws. But, as we've seen in Numbers, it wasn't always easy. They messed up. And sometimes there were some serious consequences.
Definitely. There's that story about the guy who got caught gathering wood on the Sabbath.
Oh yeah. Seems like a pretty small thing.
It does to us, but the Sabbath was holy. A day of rest, worship, a time to disconnect from the world and connect with God.
And breaking that rule, it showed disrespect.
It did. And the consequences were severe. The guy, he was brought to Moses, to the whole assembly, and God said he had to be put to death. It's a reminder, a stark reminder that actions have consequences.
Even things that seem small to us.
Right. When you violate a core principle of faith, there can be big repercussions. It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yep.
About our own actions, even the ones we think are no big deal.
It does. Makes you stop and think about the impact for ourselves and others. But Numbers isn't all, doom and gloom, right?
Of course not. It also celebrates good things. Faithfulness, courage, selflessness. Remember Phinehas, the priest who did something about that whole thing with the Moabites.
He was really devoted to God.
He was. He stood up for what he thought was right, even when it was risky. And God saw that. He made a covenant of peace with Phinehas, promised him and his descendants a lasting priesthood.
So even in all that sin, all that rebellion, people who stand up for good, they can make a difference. They get God's blessing. It's true. It gives you hope, doesn't it? That even in tough situations, we can be brave. We can have integrity.
And speaking of people who made a difference, what about Zelophehad's daughters? We left off with them getting their inheritance, but there was still that question about them marrying men from other tribes.
Oh, right. That was a big deal. Remember, the land was carefully divided. Letting it be transferred through marriage could cause real problems. So they asked Moses for guidance.
And what did God say? I always forget.
He gave them a solution, one that honored both the daughters' rights and the need to keep the tribal boundaries clear. He said Zelophehad's daughters could marry whoever they wanted, but they had to marry within their own tribe.
That's a good solution. It protects the idea of female inheritance, and it keeps the tribal land ownership intact. God really cares about everyone involved. He does. And with that, the book of Numbers comes to an end. We follow the Israelites all the way from Egypt to the very edge of the Promised Land. We saw them struggle, we saw them win, we saw this whole system of laws and rituals that was so important to them.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. Censuses, rituals, rebellions, punishment, faithfulness, heroism, a legal system that, had its flaws but tried to be fair and compassionate. It's a lot. What really stuck with you after this deep dive into Numbers?
I think for me, it's how relevant these old stories still are. They tell us about human nature, about faith, about trying to build a good society. It wasn't easy for the Israelites, and they made mistakes along the way. But through it all, God was there. Patient, loving, guiding them.
Yeah, and that's something we can all relate to, right? Our journeys are never easy. There are always challenges, setbacks. But Numbers gives us this message of hope, to trust God, to learn from our mistakes, to keep going, even when things are uncertain.
Absolutely. And now that we've left the Israelites at the edge of the Promised Land, it makes you wonder, what are our own wildernesses? What are we struggling with? How can we use what we learned from Numbers to help us?
It's a good question. It's a reminder that the journey, it's just as important as the destination. And even when things are hard, there's always hope. There's always a reason to keep going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the book of Numbers.
Yes, thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed it.